George Maben never planned to live a life of faded curtains and lukewarm tea, but at 42, that's exactly where he found himself, slumped on a creaking armchair in the narrow living room of a semi-detached house in Working, his mother shuffling somewhere behind him with a wheeze and a clatter. His days blurred into one another, daytime TV, trips to the corner shop, and the occasional bitter laugh with an old schoolmate whose luck had fared only marginally better. George had no job, no savings, and increasingly, no pride. His mother, Edith, was 83 and surprisingly sharp for her age, her tongue even sharper. She reminded him constantly that the council wouldn't wait forever for his benefits renewal forms and that a man his age should at least mow the lawn without being told. But George was used to waiting for something to change. Something good. Something big. That something arrived one Tuesday morning in early May, under an indifferent sky and with the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air outside the Royal Surrey County Hospital. George had gone to pick up Edith's prescriptions, 3 packs of blood thinners and a scolding from the pharmacist. And that's when he saw her. Sally. She stood just outside the automatic doors, scrolling through her phone, coat too light for the chill, but posture too confident to care. Blonde, maybe late 20s, with sharp, pale eyes and a kind of distracted beauty that struck George like a chord out of tune. He coughed. She looked up, smiled politely. He held that smile like a lifeline. Fate, or whatever force governed George's luck, gave him a sliver of opportunity. A clumsy joke about hospital food. A conversation that started nowhere and ended with a coffee at the Costa across the car park. Her mother was inside, undergoing tests. George didn't lie, not at first, but he certainly didn't mention Edith or the decaying house or the fact that he hadn't worked a real job in over a decade. By the 3rd coffee, Sally laughed with her whole face. By the 4th meeting, she gave him her number. 2 weeks later, they were seeing each other, and George's miserable routines shifted like old furniture dragged into sunlight. Soon, he found himself welcomed into Sally's home, a generous, sprawling place in Guildford, where her mother Maureen kept the heating on full blast and the fridge stocked like a hotel minibar. Maureen was cautious at first. George turned up in a faded coat and nervous shoes, but he was polite and didn't drink. He told stories with just enough self-deprecation to sound humble. And when Sally announced she was pregnant, Maureen, reluctant but resigned, didn't say much at all. The months that followed were the best of George's adult life. Central heating. Fresh sheets. A car with petrol in it. Maureen had the money and the space. George had charm. Or so he believed. But charm curdles when mixed with complacency. George didn't find a job. Didn't try, really. He watched telly while Maureen cleaned. Made himself a sandwich while Sally did shifts at the dental clinic. When she came home exhausted, he'd already be deep into a war documentary or half asleep on the news sectional. It was Maureen who finally cracked. One drizzly afternoon, she asked George into the conservatory. Her voice was firm. Her expression unreadable. She told him she'd had enough. Enough of the freeloading. Enough of the lazy mornings. Enough of the "I'll look for work next week" excuses. She gave him a date. 2 weeks to leave. Sally cried. George protested. But Maureen didn't waver. And so, with a plastic suitcase and a second-hand coat, George was back in Woking. Back to Edith. Back to boiled eggs and radiator noise. But something had shifted. George wasn't just waiting anymore. He was planning. He wanted that life back. The comforts. The woman. The warmth. And as his bitterness fermented into something darker, he came to one conclusion: Maureen was the problem. She stood between him and the life he deserved. And she had to be removed. Back in Woking, the house smelled the same. Damp dust, Dettol, and the weary perfume of old age. Edith didn't ask many questions. She merely raised one eyebrow, huffed, and moved a stack of unopened mail from the table so George could drop his bag. There was no welcome. Only the shuffle of her slippers down the corridor, the tap of her walking stick, and the familiar creak of her recliner chair as she settled back into her daily existence. George stared out the living room window that night, sipping cold tea, his fingers curled around the mug like claws. His mind moved faster than it had in years. He saw the plan form like breath on glass, cloudy then clear. It had to look like an accident. Maureen was old enough. She had a heart condition. It would raise no suspicions if she were found dead in her bed. But George wasn't a killer. Not yet. What he lacked in courage, though, he made up for in desperation. And desperation, he'd come to learn, was a kind of genius. He began by watching. From a borrowed coat and a rusted Peugeot he'd bought with the last of his savings, George parked a few streets away from Maureen's cul-de-sac. He knew her routine. Mondays, she volunteered at the church kitchen. Tuesdays, she had lunch with her sister in Epsom. Thursdays, she saw her cardiologist. Her patterns were clockwork. But what George hadn't expected was that Sally was drifting away. When he texted, her replies came slowly. When he called, she let it ring. Then one night, she blocked him altogether. That was the snap. George's plan took on sharper edges. If Maureen was gone, Sally would need him. She'd be vulnerable, emotional, pregnant. She'd come to him. She'd forgive him. And they could begin again. But this time on his terms. He purchased rat poison from a dodgy pet shop near Leatherhead. Slipped it into a bottle of wine with a forged note claiming it was from an old friend. Left it on Maureen's doorstep late one foggy night. But it wasn't Maureen who drank it. It was her sister, June, who visited the next morning, found the bottle, and opened it while Maureen was still out. She had a glass. Collapsed 20 minutes later. Died en route to the hospital. The town reeled. The police arrived. And for the first time in years, George felt the throb of real fear, the kind that buzzed behind the ears and made sleep a luxury. Maureen was devastated, but something about her reaction was off. Quiet, measured, and unknown to George. She'd found the note. The handwriting wasn't familiar. She kept it. She showed it to Sally. And Sally recognized the style. It wasn't long before D.S. Callum Brandt entered the picture. A quiet man with a face like a hawk and a reputation for putting together cases others dismissed. Poison, he knew, rarely came from strangers. It was the most intimate of killings, slow, silent, and close. And the note? The language was too familiar to be a random delivery. The investigation deepened. Phone records, CCTV, DNA swabs, and something else. A whisper from the priest at the local church who recalled a man in a brown coat parked outside the neighborhood several times over the past few weeks. George didn't know it yet, but they had started watching him. Meanwhile, guilt, that cruel whisper in the mind, began to crack his resolve. Edith noticed. She saw his jumpiness. The way he paced. The way he stared too long at nothing. One night, while he was out, she found the scrap of paper he'd used to practice the forged handwriting. Stuffed under a stack of TV guides. She didn't know what it meant, but she called the police. That's when things began unraveling fast. Police quietly obtained a sample of George's handwriting from old employment records. The note matched. Not conclusively, but closely enough. When they traced a cash purchase of poison from Leatherhead with a security camera still running, and matched it to George's Peugeot parked outside, the case turned from theory to certainty. But George, desperate now and sensing the net closing in, attempted one final, violent act. He waited until Maureen's volunteer shift. Followed her car. Forced it off the road in a rural stretch just past Thursday Common. She survived, barely, crawling from the crumpled wreck with a shattered hip and a torn lung. She couldn't identify her attacker through the shock. But the tire tracks matched George's car. This time they had him. Arrested outside a Tesco Express, with a stale sandwich in one hand and a face gone gray, George said nothing. Not when they cuffed him. Not when they showed him the photos. Not even when Sally, tear-streaked and angry, sat in the interview room and begged him to tell the truth. But the case wasn't easy. The poison, the car tampering, the indirect murder, it needed tying up with evidence that couldn't be shaken. That's where divine intervention, as some would call it, stepped in. A tech glitch, or a miracle, depending on who you asked, occurred when police reviewed CCTV footage from a bus camera they'd previously written off as broken. The feed kicked in just as George leaned from his Peugeot and placed the bottle of wine at Maureen's doorstep. Clear as day. Time-stamped. Full profile. In the courtroom, that footage sealed the verdict. A murmur ran through the crowd when it played. Sally wept. Edith, now in a wheelchair, didn't attend. George Maben was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of June Penner and attempted murder of Maureen O'Connell. He left behind nothing but silence. Yet some nights, residents of Woking still claim they see a figure at the bus stop, a man in a brown coat, head down, holding a bottle of wine, waiting for the moment that never comes. In prison, George quickly learned that isolation wasn't just a condition, it was a sentence within a sentence. Word of his crime had spread. Even among thieves and killers, poisoning an elderly woman and killing her innocent sister was cowardly. He kept to himself in a corner of Belmarsh, his once sly charm now reduced to nervous mutters and shifty glances. Sally never visited. Not once. She gave birth to a healthy boy 6 weeks after the trial. Named him James. Gave him her last name. She told friends she would never speak of George again. Not to James, not to anyone. And she didn't. She moved to Exeter with her mother and started over. George, meanwhile, filed appeal after appeal, all denied. 10 years into his sentence, he developed an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. Refused chemotherapy. Told the prison nurse one night, maybe this is how it was always meant to end. He died quietly in his cell. There was no funeral. Edith had passed 2 years earlier. No one came to claim the body. His life was reduced to a file, a cardboard box of worn clothes, and a yellowed envelope labeled, Evidence, Case 0941M. But somewhere, locked away in the archives of the Surrey police, a copy of that recovered bus camera footage still sits. A man in a brown coat, under a flickering street lamp, placing a bottle of poisoned wine at the doorstep of his lover's mother. One image. One moment. All it took to break the silence. And solve the crime that almost slipped through time. If you enjoyed this chilling true crime tale, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories just like this. New episodes drop regularly, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned.